Welcome, everyone.
Welcome, everyone, to this Revive Local Arts Indicators webinar. I am Anis Sengupta, the Assistant Director of Arts and Culture at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC. MAPC is the regional planning agency that serves the people who live and work in the 101 cities and towns that make up metropolitan Boston. These are lands also that are the tribal homelands of multiple indigenous peoples, including the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Pawtucket Pennacook, and the Wampanoag. We're going to get started today. I'll give a little bit of background on the project, let you know about some of the technical aspects. As you may have noticed, this meeting is being recorded, and so if you do not want to be seen on the recording, please keep your camera off and your microphone off, and you will not be on the recording. We do have the chat enabled, so if you need to communicate or have a question or think something you would like to share, feel free to use the chat to do so. So this webinar is grown out of a project that actually started before the pandemic. It grew out of work that we've been doing, cultural planning support for some of the cities and towns in our region. Arlington, in particular, had reached out to us to ask for some assistance in trying to understand how to measure progress on the areas that we had been identifying to grow the arts and culture sector and help it to thrive within our communities. Once the pandemic hit, it became clear that the project needed to shift in order to help communities understand how to document and respond to the impacts of the pandemic on the arts and culture sector. So that is where this project emerged. So as a reminder, we ask everybody during this meeting to stay muted. We'll do a short presentation of our findings. We'll have a facilitated conversation with the project partners. We have folks from Franklin and Beverly and Arlington on the call today. Please submit your questions through the chat. In the event of a disruption, the event will be canceled, and the slides that we are going through will be shared after the event. So this is the MAPC team. We have myself, we have Carolina Prieto, who is the Community Engagement Manager, Claudia Sarsua, who is our Regional Arts and Culture Planner, and Lily Perkins High, who is not on the call today, but she's the Analytical Services Manager who has been helping us with some of the data work. Today, we're going to go through an overview of the project, our survey findings, the strategies and the case studies that they emerged from, and a discussion with our panel and the audience. So the overview of the project. After COVID hit and we reconceived of what the project was going to be, we landed on three purposes. One is to document the impact of COVID-19 on local arts and culture. Two is to chart a path to response and recovery for the local arts and culture sector. And three is to recommend actions for municipalities to take that would allow them to promote recovery and track their progress. Elements of the project included an analysis of existing data on local arts and culture to set a baseline understanding of the sector, collection of data from artists to document the local impact of COVID-19 on the artist community, interviews with municipal staff to identify key challenges, and case studies of successful arts and culture programming. Our project partners, as a reminder, are the town of Arlington, the city of Boston, the city of Beverly, and the town of Franklin. And you can see that they represent a range of different geographic locations across our region. There are also different community types. We have Beverly, which is a regional urban center on the North Shore, Arlington, a streetcar suburb in our inner core, Boston, our metropolitan urban core, and Franklin which is a developing suburb of the maturing New England town subtype. And here's a glimpse of sort of the ways that all of these communities really are acting as a regional center or sub-regional center of arts and culture activity. They have clusters of creative economy more than their neighboring communities. And we are going to turn it over to Claudia to share some of the survey findings.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to briefly tell you more about our survey. If you could go to the next slide, please. Our survey was released at the beginning of this year and closed just recently in April 30th, 2021. Our goal as we launched the survey was to originally get 500 responses from across the 4 municipalities. And in the end, we received 769 responses. Next slide, please. So when we look at the responses by geography, we're also comparing them with 2 other COVID impact surveys in the region, one from Mass Cultural Council and one from the City of Boston COVID Impact Survey. The Revive survey, our project, received 582 respondents that live in the study area and 647 that live or work in the study area. And I want to commend our partners because the outreach that they did to get these responses show in the comparison across the 3 surveys. Next slide, please. And when we talk about the disciplines represented in the survey, we see that the top 3 disciplines are studio-based art, design arts, and community arts across the 4 municipalities. When we look at their creative space, we see that 59% of artists are working from home. And by discipline, 58% of studio artists are still working from home. And in contrast, 32% of dance and movement artists are working outside of home. Next slide, please. And when we asked about stability of space across the 4 municipalities, we see that more artists own their creative space. However, when we asked them about stability and affordability of their space, in our survey, the Revive survey, we see that 27% of respondents were unsure if they could afford their creative space in the next year. Next slide, please. For income, we asked an average of their income reported for 2020. And in the Revive survey, we see that 46% of respondents earn less than $20,000. And compared to the Boston survey, which was done in the fall of 2020, we see that more respondents reported their income being between $20,000 and $50,000. Next slide, please. And income losses, we want to note that artists of color reported an average of 68% loss of creative income, in contrast to white artists that they reported a 52% loss of creative income. In particular, in Boston, in the COVID survey, Black artists reported that they lost over $3,700 on average, more than their white counterparts. Next slide, please. And when we look in particular at the specific impacts to their creative practice, there's really not a lot of difference between artists of color and artists that identified as white. So we see that 20% of artists of color report closure of schools, cultural facilities, and spaces to teach, create, and present your work as having an impact versus 19% of closures of schools, cultural facilities, and spaces to teach as having an impact for artists that identified as white. Next slide, please. So when we ask them about opportunities for recovery, we see that 70% of participants of color report wanting more direct communication from municipal staff, while 55% of artists that identify as white report the same. And 52% of participants of color report wanting more support for outdoor creative practice. and 37% of artists that identified as white report the same. And across all of our responses, even outside of the 4 municipalities that we're working with, 23% of artists report that they're shifting their creative practice to outdoor spaces. And thus 49% of artists would like more opportunities for their to take their creative practice outdoors. Next slide, please. And when we asked them about their well-being, the top 2 issues they reported was social isolation and increased dependent care across all of our the 4 municipalities and outside the study area. Next slide, please. And just a quick glance at the demographic data, our respondents were overwhelmingly white, female over 35, and college-educated respondents. So I will now pass it over to Carolina Prieto, who will tell you more about the case studies that we looked at and the strategies for recovery that we have identified based on our research.
Thanks, Claudia. Hi, everyone. My name is Carolina Prieto. So we're just going to talk about the casing. I'm going to go through most of these quite quickly, but we'll be able to provide you with the slide deck afterwards, and you can go dive more into these. I'll also review some of the recommendations that we're looking at so far. So you can go to the next slide. So we've kind of talked about this, the Cabot theater, thinking about, last year they had over 1,700 tickets sold in 30 minutes. They, provided opportunities for people to perform. This was on a private property, and they really looked at art as healing during the time as the pandemic was rushing on, and we were able to provide a lot of programming for people during that time. Next slide. Some of the key takeaways was their partnership with the historic Beverly group, and prompted by the pandemic, that really enabled them to work towards a stronger relationship, and obviously with the city, building that out. And then, really having a sense of key safety protocols. And, as we're thinking about the reopening status, thinking about, how to start with things that are, less risky, thinking about, starting out with movies, for example, which will be easier to program and have less risk. Next slide. So another case that we looked at was Starlight Square in Cambridge. Oh, if you can go back, perfect. So it's located in the cultural district in Cambridge. And has really worked, and if you can see some of their programming that's actually scheduled for this year, very exciting, but really started with the concept of square in a square prior to the pandemic, and really have been able to transform municipal parking lots into outdoor venues for the public. And they're, like I said, they're working on their 2nd season now. Next slide. So one of the key takeaways was kind of re-identifying the district, leveraging the cultural district partnerships. So cultural districts, great partners for the work that hopefully you all will be doing, and then demand for the container for the work, and then ticketing as a way of managing flow. That was a really important piece of this. Even if tickets were free, ticketing really helped manage numbers and understanding of who was in the space. Next slide. We also looked at Street Stage, the Boston Lyric Opera, and they looked at individual health assessments at every performance to make sure that artists were safe and social distancing. That was very common during this time. And then an online stream service that was launched during this time, which helped sort of marry some of the outdoor pop-up events with what they were doing virtually. Slide. So I'll kind of dive into some of the recovery strategies that have come from some of the interviews that we've done, the casing and the data work, and how we're putting it all together. So if you can go to the first slide. So the first one is trying to address barriers to cultural equity. What we're finding is that there were so many differences between different types of culture and who is taking up space. So some of the questions that you could ask yourself is, Where does cultural activity happen? Are opportunities for creative and cultural expression equally available for immigrant communities and communities of color? And do you have a body of stakeholders that you can talk to about this so that you're not doing this by yourself, but you're really leveraging conversations and others' relationships to be able to improve sort of how you're approaching cultural equity in this work? Next slide. Facilitating the use of outdoor spaces. So, generally when we started this project, we really, thought generally about, the arts and culture community, but really started to narrow on improving outdoor spaces as a key component of not only what happened during the pandemic and continues to do so, but also sort of the reopening opportunities. So outdoor spaces as an important asset to bring cultural programming, and then improving access to outdoor spaces, including a directory of existing public venues or innovative use of public space. For example, the use of, leveraging partnership with farmers markets, for example. So clear, consistent public health protocols is one of the key elements of how to approach the work. We all know this, but I think thinking about timed entrances through ticketing, timed entrances have been used a lot and is just much more manageable for staff to think about as you're starting to build up your programming. Marking or seating arrangements, outdoor highly ventilated locations and shaded areas. As we know, it's been a really hot few days, and I think thinking about how to make sure that you have shaded areas as you're promoting some of the outdoor spaces will be key, and keeping everybody cool and engaged. So support for arts and culture reopening. Like we said, safety guidelines for arts and culture programming aligned with other industries. So looking at other options for how this is happening in other industries, and we'll have some of that in the final report. Adopting and advertising clear guidance and crowd management guidelines. I mean, signage and communication, even individuals being at some of these locations to tell people how things are going to function will be really important. Provide guidance on to organizations that are not up to date on safety protocols so they can participate in your programming. From the city level or town level, having appropriate guidance and having ways to answer people's questions ahead of time so that before programming gets underway, things are very clear and understandable for the staff and volunteers who are managing those. Next slide. So I think we talked a little bit about this, but district-based partnerships and structures, we have some assets that are ready, to be leveraged in the programming that you'll try to implement. Building relationships amongst arts organizations, cultural organizations, business, and municipalities. I think, I said, well, should we really include this? I think from the conversations, yes. I mean, it seems like an obvious thing, but really, improving those and really thinking about how do we think about the existing boxes that we're in and really allowing things to flow in relationships and partnerships that you build during this time, I think will be really important. Seeking regional connections, to us and to other conversations that are happening in the region. We'll be happy to include some of that as well. And then creative coalition options, like I said, do you have a group of individuals or stakeholders that are giving you advice, providing backup and understanding of, where arts and culture is going in the town or city and how we can build upon that. So kind of coalition conversations can be really useful in that reopening phase. Expediting permitting, so lowering permitting requirements to increase programming opportunities where possible, partnering with public health agencies. I think that has been like one of the first things that people did when we were kind of having to deal with all of this. And I think being able to understand, how to promote cultural programming and also overcome any permitting barriers and providing clear guidance for the organizations themselves, because they're really good at providing arts and cultural programming. I think we, from the municipal side, really being able to give that clear guidance would be really important. Expanding access and participation. So some of the things that we heard was around youth engagement. So finding opportunities for people to provide summer employment, community service, or classes specific to youth, promoting accessible engagement. So expanding communication types, language usage, and ADA accessibility, and making sure that that is a part of the conversations as you're thinking about programming. Considering innovative use of public space, so either like parking lots, outdoor dining, or parklets, just having that piece, thinking more creatively. And, we do have a shared streets program that has some of this information as well. I'm happy to share. And then considering hybrid programming, as we're sort of expanding access and participation, we all know that hybrid or virtual programming has been quite expansive for many of us during this time. And as we're getting into in-person, sort of thinking about what is the in-person and virtual component of your arts and cultural programming that you want to implement. Slide. Lastly, I'll talk about building capacity for municipal staff. So, again, we can't stress enough relationships, partnerships, leveraging the desires and wants of individuals in the community who are leaders and passionate about arts and culture. Establishing a volunteer arts and culture recovery advisory committee that can really help guide some of the development of how some of these programming happens, I think would be really useful, especially in areas that you may have less expertise in or understanding of, and finding folks that can help leverage that expertise. And then providing workforce development opportunities for the creative economy itself so that they're able to start developing a stronger kind of foothold on how to approach their work and their partnership development aside from their artistic practice. All right, so I'm going to pass it back to Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you, Ines. I think we can stop sharing our screen. I will now give a chance to our partners to introduce themselves, where they're coming from, and their role in the arts and culture sector. In the meantime, we will drop a couple of questions in the chat for the audience if they could just tell us more about why they're here and what they would like to see for recovery of the arts and culture sector. So I will start with Brenda. You're muted. There you go, thanks.
I'm Brenda Murphy from Beverly. I'm on the Cultural Council there, and I'm also on Beverly Main Streets.
Thank you, Brenda. I will now go with Darlene.
Good morning. I'm Darlene Nguyen. I'm the planning director for the city of Beverly. We're one of the partners in the Beverly Arts District with Beverly Main Streets and Montserrat College of Art, and also do some of the implementation of arts policy on our own.
Thanks, Darlene. I will go over to Jenny.
Good morning. I'm Jenny Raid. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development, and my team works pretty actively with the Commission for Arts and Culture. And actually, one of the commissioners is here today, Steve Poltrajewski. And I'm just happy to talk more about what we've been learning.
Thanks. I will hand it over to Pandora.
Good morning. I'm Pandora Carlucci. I'm a volunteer member of the Franklin Cultural District Committee. I also serve on other boards and commissions in town, including Franklin Radio and Television, which is a nice partner to the Cultural District.
Thank you, Pandora. I'll hand it over to Nancy.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nancy Schoen, and I'm the chair of the Franklin Cultural District. We're an all-volunteer committee that's been appointed by the town, and we're excited to share that we're going to be hosting an Art Walk Festival that's going to be featuring a lot of our local artists and musicians this upcoming weekend.
Thanks, Nancy. And lastly, Brian.
Thanks, Claudia. I'm Brian Taberner, the Director of Planning and Community Development for the town of Franklin. And we provide staff support and assistance to the Cultural District Committee and other organizations.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Well, we have all of you here we'd like to talk more about the recovery and reopening, as you know, the state has been in the last 2-3 weeks started to slowly reopen, or perhaps not that slowly for some of us. First, I'd like to ask all of you if you could share more about what are the challenges you're still grappling with that you see that the sector needs and for recovery. Anyone wants to jump in, or if you'd like me to call out?
I can jump in if you want. I mean, I think for us in Beverly, a lot of the challenges existed before the pandemic that we're still struggling with, and they were just exacerbated by the pandemic. And kind of thinking about capacity, which you mentioned, both municipal capacity, but also capacity of the arts and culture sector, and incentivizing is right. Getting people excited about participating and being involved. There's a lot of people we have a lot of arts and culture entities working in the community, and I think we've had issues in the past bringing people together. And I think as events have fallen off and opportunities to connect have fallen off, that's really only gotten harder. And so one of our challenges, I think, we bringing people back in and bring new people in and trying to reinvigorate the arts and culture sector and give people opportunities to work together, to show art, to have cultural experiences in the city, and use it as an opportunity for community building. So that's one of our challenges. We have many. But
Great.
And if I can extend to that, part of that challenge is as things opened up very quickly and suddenly, in order to do events, we have to move very quickly. We don't have the planning time. We want to do all these things while the weather's warm and we can be outdoors, but it takes time to plan them. We were able to do something in May, and we're trying to do something in July and August, but we're going on triple time trying to make it happen.
And I'll piggyback on that as well. You know, with this Art Walk Festival, it's exciting that we're able to do it. We had hoped that originally it would be a little bit broader in scale, with, you know, food trucks and a beer garden and a local winery participating, but we at the time couldn't to make that step because of the limits of the COVID restrictions. And now that those quickly went away, it's unfortunate, but we still didn't feel comfortable trying to rush something together because we want to keep people safe. And there's a lot of caution on the part of people participating in events. So as we open up this weekend, we want to be respectful of where everybody is at in terms of their safety and comfort of attending things. So we want to try to get that right. But I'd also say the capacity and resources. The reason we're actually able to have this event is because of the support of the Mass Cultural Council and the Franklin Cultural Council. Without that funding, it certainly wouldn't have been possible. So we're really grateful for that and hope that maybe there'll be that same kind of support in the future so that we can continue some of these things.
I would like to just add to Nancy's thought, and the support from Mass Cultural Council and our Franklin Cultural Council has been tremendous, but the support from the community as a whole has also been tremendous. And we are at a period of reflection as we look back on what we have done the past 14, 15 months, and some has been successful. And what do we bring with us forward as we move into this next phase of recovery? We want to keep our strengths with us as we support artists and creatives and the community as a whole. So there's a lot of learning happening at the same time that we're planning events.
What are the things you're thinking you might want to bring with you? What were the successes?
I think one of the successes has been, this is just me. I have no data to back this up. So this is all anecdotal but it's listening to people who were engaged, who found different ways to share arts and culture using technology. We had a strong presence by Franklin TV recording and partnering with our local regional theater, working with our schools, working with the cultural district. We had artists and teachers giving performances on Facebook Live. We had a lot of different ways that allowed people that previously hadn't been able to engage with culture and the arts, to be able to connect. So we want to, we're looking at moving forward, but how do we bring some of that connection, that access, that realization of the whole town, everybody coming.
Mhm.
I
also,
Brian.
yeah, to add to that, I think in Franklin in particular, we had a lot better communication in some ways in terms of, groups establishing newsletters. I know that our cultural district started a newsletter last June, and we've doubled our distribution list in the course of this past year. So I think word is getting out. The schools also started putting out a monthly bulletin. And I think that communication piece has really increased access to certain things. And our senior center has done a wonderful job putting things online, and our library is just off the charts in terms of what programming they've done online. And I think going forward, they'll probably continue to offer some of that because, again, it increased accessibility for so many different segments of our population.
I wanted to piggyback on that a little bit as well. I mean, one of the other things that I said we would be grappling with is how we do things differently and take these lessons that we've learned from during the pandemic. And I think in the beginning, when, it was a lot of our creative partners who were proposing to do activities differently, such as the Cabot, who did the case study that was featured on the Hale Farm with small live in-person events over last summer. When those were initially proposed, there was this kind of, bureaucratic response like, we can't do that. We can't have beer gardens there, or, the neighbors are going to be upset, and that kind of notion. And then it ended up being perfectly fine and lovely and a really great event. And so how can we take that kind of, previous inertia, someone described it to me the other day, of that's sometimes typical in government, and kind of turn it on its head and take these lessons that we've learned from doing some of these more unique opportunities, often led by other people, and also, with outdoor dining, and having more events outside and finding additional spaces where we can do those types of events is something that we're going to work on moving forward.
I think that's a very good point. Finding the new uses of outdoor spaces that we did last summer and bringing them forward into the future. I think the worst thing people can do is think, okay, now things are back to normal, and go back to what they were. You can't go back to what it was. Everything's new, and you have to have an open mind and take the things that were positive and worked and bring it into the future. And looking back on what could have helped people during this time, in case something like this comes again, is maybe it would have been good to offer some kind of workshops to help organizations have a larger presence online, and also workshops for individual arts and culture type people, like how do you help artists, how do you help the musicians or the performing arts. If there were workshops available to them, that may have helped them get through this better.
Thank you, Brenda. Before we get to the opportunities and needs for recovery, I want to give a chance to Jenny to speak to, the challenges in Arlington and, any lessons you've taken from that.
Sure. Thank you, Claudia. I didn't want to get in Beverly or Franklin's way. It's a good flow going there. It really mirrors a lot of what everybody else has said. I mean, we've learned a lot from some of the things that we've been doing. Honestly, a lot of the things that have been happening are things that we had always wanted to have happen, and because of some relaxed rules and opportunities, I think it sort of, made people able to do things that we haven't been able to do before, including the work that we've been doing in our town parks and open spaces, where it relates to for-profit enterprises. We technically do not allow that to occur in the town. And so that's something that we still need to address, because after the expiration of the state of emergency, things would technically revert back to the way that they were before. And so we're very hopeful that we can hold on to some of the things that we've benefited from. But I think in general, I think the one thing that maybe I didn't hear anybody else say, but is also probably something most would agree is still an issue, is really funding for artists. And, you know, the recovery, many artists, particularly musicians, but many other artists really lost a lot of revenue and a lot of opportunities during the pandemic. And I think really trying to figure out the best way to ease folks back into a full recovery mode is really something very critical for the town of Arlington. And I think related to that is, I believe Nancy may have touched on this, is, you know, all of this came about so rapidly that everything would be back to being in person, but most, you know, creative people who are planning events need a lot of time to pull things together. They need, you know, a runway before things actually launch. So it's not that easy to just sort of bump, you know, everything back into place the way it was before. So I think that towns and cities moving forward in the recovery process need to be aware of the fact that people need time to plan things and be thoughtful about them, still develop the right parameters so people feel safe. You know, I realize there won't be relaxed, you know, there won't be restrictions rather, but I think that people need to feel that level of safety still. So these are the kinds of things that we're talking about in Arlington, among many other things that are both challenges. And I guess I've started to kind of touch on some of where we see some opportunities.
Yes, thank you. I do want to pick up on that, on opportunities, and hear from all of you about, you know, what do you need to carry over to make those opportunities a success? You know, Jenny, you mentioned funding. Of course, funding is needed, but what other strategies, you know, at state level, local level, do you see, do you need right now to further the recovery?
I want to pick up on something that Pandora said about the cultural district. I think focusing more on the cultural districts as much as possible and providing them with as much additional capacity and support would really be very helpful, particularly in Arlington. But I'm guessing that this is an issue in other places as well. While we have been looking beyond our proper cultural district and we have an arts and culture action plan in place that we've been actively implementing, our cultural district and many of the businesses and the artists in that part of our community continue to kind of need additional support. So anything beyond Mass Cultural Council and other partners coming together to help those districts, I think could be very beneficial.
Thank you, Jenny. Brian?
Yeah, I have a thought on it. I think we, all towns, all communities right now, they're struggling to, okay, now that there aren't that many restrictions in place right now, there's two things. What is safe? And if putting people in a theater, filling them up is safe right now, then okay, but it seems like it's not because of the way things are still out there. There are still people getting sick and dying from COVID. So it's difficult for any industry to know the right thing. You go into a supermarket now, some of them have their plexiglass at the counters already down. I mean, others are being much more, restrictive and everything. But I think in a way that we need to continue, and I think there's going to be a lot of the continuing with the programs. If you think about just, well, I have actually one great example is Felicia from the library in Franklin sent me I asked her, so what were your challenges? What were you doing? And how did you respond? And they developed a really robust monthly programming schedule. It's consisted over 30 programs. And they have story time, they have science and art projects, musical performances. And they do plan on continuing at least a lot of that into the future. Not only because of COVID, but because it reaches more people, and it's actually a good, positive thing. So your art programs are going to be reached by more people than they would before. The music performances are going to be seen by more people, and I think we need to not focus all on that, obviously, because the theaters and the other organizations need to, and in the live performances usually are obviously. It has made, they've done a crazy, I can't imagine the amount of technology 20 years ago, if this happened now, people would have been hurting 10 times more than they are now, especially in the arts, because they didn't have the access, they didn't have the technology back then. Now and I think that the other thing I was thinking about is something Roberta mentioned, that there are people, not Roberta, but Pandora mentioned, sorry, Roberta is another one of our allies in the field here. But Pandora did mention to me recently about, why don't we check the data, because we checked on our hotels and restaurants and how they're doing and everything, and how did they do last year. So you go back and look at the tax revenues from the town, I guess, is a way to do that. And we had 70% it was 70% of the normal, if you will, for hotels. And we were roughly 95% restaurant revenue from the year before. That's how in the world is that possible? It's because programs, people supporting their restaurants and doing that. They were still worth people that went out of business, but it went a whole lot worse if the communities didn't get together. So those are the type of things that the artists and in all of the theaters and anybody out there that's working the arts, towns still need to kick in. They still need to help, and the people living in the communities too. The challenges are there, and especially in the arts and culture right now. Businesses they take a hit and then they somehow get back to normal, but it's taking a while. It will take a while for the arts to recover.
Definitely. It was discussed, planning takes time for all of these outdoor programming events or indoor as allowed now. I want to get to priorities now for recovery and reopening in the short term. So if you could each tell me, what are the let's say one or two priorities you see that need to be addressed for the recovery of the sector? And, it can be as immediate for the summer, it can be long-term, like Beverly said, Darlene, you mentioned that, some of these issues were already pre-pandemic. I guess I'll hand it over now to Darlene. Sorry to put you on the spot. If you can think of one or two priorities.
Yeah, we have a few priorities. I think because it's somewhat related to arts and culture, and I kind of mentioned this before, but kind of formalizing the use of outdoor spaces for events, for dining, for retail. Having a process that's clear, and when somebody says, well, how do I do this, we can tell them who to go to, because that was one of the hurdles, is that we hadn't really done this before. So what is the process, and who are the people they have to go to? One of our other priorities, and this is, as I said, largely independent of the pandemic, is establishing an artist in residence program that we have a grant from Mass Cultural Council to do. And we want to use that person to kind of also help. Our goal is to have that entity also help with recovery by capturing the community spirit and what's going on as the city comes back. And then also a long-term goal has been to establish a public art program, and I think that our public art policy, I think that's another way of moving outside. What can we do outside from a fine art and a public art and a performing arts perspective? So again, talking about how do we bring art to more people, arts and culture to more people more of the time.
Thank you. I have a feeling that establishing or formalizing outdoor programming and dining is going to be a common theme. Jenny, do you want to share what your priorities are for the recovery of the sector?
Yeah, our priorities include assisting local nonprofits and getting sort of legacy events up and running in 2021, sort of a lot of the things that we've been talking about, but we have Porch Fest, we have this chairful where you sit fundraiser and sort of, promotion of those legacy events is really important. So also promoting street performances and parklets, highlighting and promoting real world implementation of projects that kicked off during the pandemic in more of a virtual format and sort of bridging to in-person activities. And then kind of back to the point about, sort of artists in the public spaces, really trying to make a case for expanding the footprint of artist opportunities in town, and assuring the success of 2 local theaters that are really vital to our local economy, and potentially partnering on various local campaigns with them to bring people back into those local districts.
Sounds like it's going to be a busy couple of months.
Yeah, lots of
Thank you.
partners involved.
I'll hand it over to Franklin. I don't know, Pandora and Nancy, if you want to speak on behalf of the Cultural Council, Cultural District.
Nancy, do you want me to go?
Why don't I
first?
just mention one thing that, I'm Brian, one thing that was mentioned about the outdoor dining, outdoor events and things of that nature. And then I just noticed in the chat here, Heather Hoffman mentioning, are there legal hurdles? And the issue is, yeah, once the state of emergency ends, I know in Franklin, anybody wanting to continue to do what they do, it's a zoning issue, right? It becomes an issue with the local community and on what they, do they want to change their bylaws to, make it easier to do this or not? Without doing so, then you go back and, restaurants that are using an alleyway or a back parking lot somewhere, they won't be doing that unless the town makes the effort to make some changes. So that's, I think, very important. And it's what I've been thinking about. I mean, the arts community out there is thinking about how to survive. And I'm thinking about how, things like this. What is it that we can do to make it a little bit easier for them? So sorry, I didn't mean to jump in front of Nancy or Pandora, but I just wanted to make a note on that. What are your thoughts, ladies?
Pandora, did you want to speak?
Well, okay. I agree with everything that Brian talked about with regards to zoning. He really leads and guides and supports us and is such a wealth of knowledge and information for the cultural district. He is our bridge to the town and really helps us to make those connections. I think my thought would be something more global and not quite as specific as zoning, but it would be that as we move forward, as we look to new initiatives and new projects as we come out of this pandemic, that culture and the arts would be considered within the whole of the project as opposed to a separate entity. Oftentimes, it's its own separate project. It would be nice if it was a component of the entire project. So if we're doing a downtown project or we're doing something for the library, the culture and the arts is one of the main components of that project. That's just a thought. Nancy, thank you. Go ahead.
You're welcome. And I totally echo what Pandora said. I think we participated recently in a Massachusetts Cultural Council check-in. And I believe it was Cambridge, I could be wrong, that has an ordinance that any project that is completed within the town includes the arts sector. It's part of what they are required to do. And I just think we could so benefit from that, just making the arts always a part of the conversation. Because I think once you're at the table, the likelihood that you're going to be able to interject and support the artists and the musicians in a community is going to be greatly enhanced. And I loved, I can't remember who said exactly, expanding the footprint for artists and opportunities. I just think that's an outstanding thought, and I would like to see that be a priority. This art walk for us is just dipping our toe in the water. We're so excited to be able to feature our visual artists who we have lots of performing, especially pre-COVID. We have a beautiful brand new high school auditorium, And we have Dean College that has an auditorium. We have the Black Box Theater, which puts on spectacular performances. So we have a lot of things for the performing artists, but our visual artists don't have a space to consistently display their works. And they haven't been able to in the past, do a show at Town Hall or do a show at the Senior Center and then sell their works because of our town ordinances. So I'd love to see more opportunities for them to be able to present their work, have these shows, and then sell their work. I mean, they've taken such a huge hit during this. And also, if we could come up with, a pop-up space in our downtown area for street performances, I think that would be another great thing to add to our community. So just some general ideas. Those are my thoughts. We haven't had a chance to really process them together as a cultural district committee yet, but lots to look forward to in the future, I hope.
Thank you, everyone. I will now give an opportunity for the audience to ask any questions and join the conversation. I see that Heather does have a question about the legal hurdles of continuing the use of outdoor spaces. If, municipal staff can speak to their local legal hurdles.
And it looks like there's a follow-up from her. Does the anti-aid amendment get in the way of doing some of these things that we have found so important in the past several months?
Well, I answered part of that question before with regard to, in Arlington anyway, our local Parks and Rec Commission has a sort of a policy. It's not really a bylaw or anything, but a policy about not allowing, they have like sort of a history of no commerce of any kind being conducted in parks. And we still need to sort of address that issue. So I don't know if that's necessarily a bylaw amendment or a policy per se. It's more of just a practice that's occurred, but it might be similar in other communities. And so after the, when the, those programs that we've been operating in the parks only have basically 60 days after the end of the state of emergency to continue operations, just based upon the construct of the state of emergency. And we're just concerned about that, but we would have to address it with the Parks and Rec Commission. I also dropped into the chat, not exactly related to this, but related to outdoor dining and parklets, which I do think is all part of the vitality that we've been experiencing. And noted that in Brookline, we adopted something about, permanent year-round opportunities, but it required two different types of amendments to bylaws. One is a town bylaw amendment, or in other terms, like a city ordinance type amendment, and the other one is a zoning amendment. And it sort of depends upon your local charter as to where you embed these different restrictions and requirements, but that's how it looked in Brookline.
Can you tell us more about that process? Like, who originated that energy?
It came from the Department of Planning and Community Development in Brookline, actually, particularly from the Economic Development Director and the Economic Development Advisory Board, Chamber of Commerce, and lots of partners in the Coolidge Corner and Brookline Village, who really pressured the town to find a permanent solution to outdoor space and opportunities. And then they brought it to a warrant article, two different warrant articles to town meeting, which both were passed overwhelmingly.
So it can be done.
It can happen.
It can
happen where you live too. Yes.
Darlene, do you want to tell us more about the legal hurdles on, like you said, formalizing outdoor programming and dining?
Sorry, my audio is weird. Yeah, I think it's similar, to what Jenny said. I mean, there's also, for us, there's, the ABCC has been more flexible with the emergency order, so the Alcohol and Beverage Commission, and even restoring, I guess the question is, will their restrictions and their process continue, or will that be modified? So that is another legal hurdle. I think it's just there are legal things that need to be addressed, and that's what we're working on. Whether we established a public use policy or a public license, a use license to use sidewalks and streets, and so we'll need to modify that if we end up passing whether it's an ordinance or a simple policy and procedure, there will be numerous steps that need to be put into place. And it just reminds me of how quickly we need to act. We're hoping that it gets extended throughout the season, regardless of the 60-day post end of the emergency order that is current now. But if that's not the case, we have 60 days to try and nail this down and figure it out so that people don't have to pick everything up in August, because that's probably, I think last fall was the most successful time for outdoor dining. It's kind of brutal out there right now, but people are still doing it.
Yeah. So it looks like we're getting to the end of our time. I want to give a chance to our partners to share any upcoming events or opportunities that you'd like to share with the audience or with the rest of the project team. I will be sharing our contact information and the website of our partners in the chat for the audience to look at. Any closing thoughts? Let's see, from the MIPC team.
I would just say thank you to everyone who has come. Thank you to all of our partners for participating in this project. We've learned so much alongside of you and continue to learn as we're all kind of in this strange place together. And it is great to hear all that has been accomplished and all of the things that you all have underway to really expand this work moving into the future and throughout the recovery of the pandemic. So thank you.
And I'll just say that, this is a continuous process. So as things are popping up, feel free to engage us in how things are working and help us. We're happy to be the connectors and happy to take on that role to make sure that people get what they need and we can move forward together. So thanks.
Thank you, Annis and Carolina. From our partners, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us, the rest of the audience?
Maybe I could start by saying thank you to MAPC for all the work that you're doing, and including these 4 communities in this great project. It was a learning experience for everybody, I think, and hopefully our communities will get something out of it, but others also in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Well, I will go ahead and share our contact information. I thank everyone that joined us today in this very hot day. Hopefully you're all staying cool. I will be in touch with our project team and our partners for next steps. And here's our contact information if anyone wants to reach us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you for hosting this, and thanks for having us all here today.
Thank you, Jenny.
Very much for your time and support. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Nancy.
It's been a really great experience also to meet the other communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Pandora.
Yes, hopefully we can be a tag team to be able to tackle some of these things together. So
Thank you, Brenda.
It's been great, wonderful meeting all of you, and our cities are so similar but so different, and learning from each other.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye.